Panama and the vital canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The new president has repeatedly said that the U.S. should take back control of the waterway.
The Panama Canal has been at the center of global trade and security for centuries, but its future is now in jeopardy. Trump's recent call for the US to reclaim control of this vital waterway has sparked a fierce debate.
Are not followed, then we will demand that the Panama Canal be returned to the United States of America.
Panama's president firmly rejects any claims, but tensions are rising as China's growing influence in the region complicates the situation. With rising tolls, security concerns, and economic stakes, this issue has the potential to reshape US-Panama relations. In this video, we'll dive into why Trump wants the canal and explore what might happen next. Let's get into it.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
Before we dive into the current conflict, we need to understand the story of the Panama Canal. This waterway has shaped global trade and security for centuries. As early as the 1500s, people saw Panama as the perfect place to connect the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. If you look at a map, you'll see a narrow strip of land separating the Caribbean Sea in the north from the Pacific Ocean in the south. There was a strong economic need for a canal. As global trade grew, ships needed a faster route between oceans. Spain, which controlled Panama in 1510, wanted an easier way to trade with the Pacific coast of the Americas. Sailing around South America was slow and extremely dangerous. But building a canal was nearly impossible at the time. The two oceans are 50 miles, 80 kilometers apart, and the land in between is rugged and high. One of the biggest obstacles was the Culebra Cut, a massive ridge standing 360 feet, 110 meters tall. In the 16th century, digging through that with simple tools was unimaginable. Centuries later, the situation changed. Spain lost control of its empire, and the United States took interest in the region. For the US, the canal was a crucial shortcut, cutting 8,000 nautical miles, 15,000 kilometers, off the journey between the east and west coasts. Before attempting a canal, the US built a railway. Opened in 1855, the Panama Railroad allowed goods to cross the land quickly, saving months of travel. But even this was a massive challenge, costing $8 million, worth hundreds of millions today, and causing 5,000 to 10,000 worker deaths due to disease and harsh conditions. At first, the US preferred building a canal in Nicaragua. That country had a large lake and a short, low-elevation route. Nicaragua also had a more stable government than Colombia, which controlled Panama. In 1835, the US Senate even declared Nicaragua the official canal location. But political instability and British interference stopped the project before it began. Meanwhile, in 1881, French engineers, inspired by their success with the Suez Canal, launched a plan to build the Panama Canal. They raised millions from investors, promising huge profits. But the project quickly turned into a disaster. Panama's jungle was filled with deadly snakes, insects, and worst of all, diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Thousands of French workers were dying every year during the Panama Canal project. Heavy rain was another danger, risking landslides that could wash away sections of the canal. The mountainous terrain in Panama also made the job far more difficult than the one in Egypt. At first, the engineers wanted a sea-level canal, which meant massive digging, especially near the Culebra Cut. But the French effort was a disaster. By 1889, the company had gone bankrupt, 22,000 workers had died, and investors lost everything. In 1894, another French company took over, but they knew a change was needed. They decided to build an artificial lake by damming the Chagres River and use a lock system to lift ships up and down, like a giant staircase for boats. The lake would provide the power for the lifts. But even with this new plan, the French couldn't finish the job. By 1898, the project was almost at a standstill, and the company was ready to sell. That's when the United States stepped in. The US saw the canal as essential for trade and military power. President Theodore Roosevelt, influenced by lobbyists, pushed to buy the French assets. The US government took control in 1902 and tried to negotiate with Colombia to lease the canal zone. When Colombia rejected the offer, Roosevelt supported Panama's independence in 1903, a move historians believe was encouraged by the US. Once Panama was free, they signed a deal with the US, giving them control of the canal zone. Construction, however, was still a huge challenge. The US followed a plan similar to the French one, building an artificial lake and lock system. 6 years were spent building the Gatun Dam, creating a massive 164 square mile lake. Workers also dug the Culebra Cut, removing millions of cubic yards of material. Even with modern tools, landslides and diseases caused many setbacks and delays, with nearly 6,000 workers dying. In the end, after 10 years, the canal was completed in 1914. It became one of the greatest engineering achievements ever, shaping global trade and growth for decades. During World War I and World War II, the US and its allies relied heavily on the Panama Canal to move ships, troops, and supplies across the globe. While this was a huge advantage for them, the people of Panama felt unfairly treated. The canal divided their land, making it feel like their country was under foreign control. In response to local criticism, the US made changes with the 1936 and 1955 treaties. They gave back more land and water near the canal, raised wages for workers, and allowed Panama to control the ports of Colon and Panama City. But for Panama, that still wasn't enough. Inspired by a global push for independence, Panama demanded full control over the canal. After years of negotiations, US President Jimmy Carter signed the Panama Canal Treaty in 1977, marking a historic shift. The US agreed to give up control of the canal and the surrounding zone, with Panama gaining full sovereignty after a 20-year transition. Panama would also run the canal. This decision made Carter very popular in Panama, and even after his passing, the country expressed deep gratitude. Panama's president praised Carter for helping the nation regain its sovereignty. However, Carter's deal came with conditions outlined in the Neutrality Treaty of 1977. Panama was required to give equal access to all countries using the canal and could not charge different tolls.
A new era of understanding and comprehension, friendship and mutual respect throughout not only this hemisphere but throughout the world.
In times of war, however, the US and Panama's navies would have priority. The treaty also banned foreign military bases in Panama. Some critics, like Donald Trump, argue that Panama has violated these terms. Trump has called the deal a bad one for the US, claiming Panama has taken advantage of the situation, particularly by raising tolls. He believes Panama hasn't been fair in its treatment of global trade, which is a key point in his criticism of the agreement. To understand the full impact of this deal, we need to look at what happened between 1977 and today. The US invasion of Panama led to massive destruction, with hundreds or even thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire. Following the invasion, Panama decided to abolish its military, a decision still in place today. The military had become deeply unpopular under dictatorship, and the US supported its dissolution. Panama's position made this possible, as it faces little threat from neighboring countries. Costa Rica has no military, relations with Colombia are stable, and the US would likely intervene if an external force attacked. Today, Panama relies on civilian forces for security and border control. This approach has worked well for Panama over the past 30 years. The economy has thrived, even seeing double-digit GDP growth at times. With a GDP per capita nearing $20,000, Panama is now a high-income nation, thanks in part to the Panama Canal. The canal generates substantial revenue, and Panama has invested in upgrading it, adding a new lane and larger locks for bigger ships. Now, let's explore why Trump has called for the US to take control of the canal. Despite its stable history, new challenges are emerging. The first issue is economic. Nearly 15,000 ships pass through the canal each year, and the US makes up 74% of this traffic. However, American companies are paying higher tolls. Maintaining the canal is expensive, but these rising fees are hurting US interests. In 2022, the average toll was $54,000, and some ships pay much more. The limited number of transit slots also leads to record-breaking bids like a $4 million crossing in 2023. A water shortage has made these issues worse, as ships rely on fresh water to pass through the locks. Critics argue the shortage isn't as severe as claimed, and suggest Panama may be limiting supply to increase toll prices. In 2024, the canal generated $5 billion in revenue, with over 60% as profit, much of it from the US. Trump criticized this, calling it a rip-off, as Panama continues to profit from American shipping companies. Beyond trade, the canal holds national security importance for the US. The Navy relies on it to move ships between oceans during conflicts. Trump has also voiced concern over China's growing influence in Panama, particularly with the construction of the Colon container port by Chinese companies, which could be used strategically by China in a crisis. The land bridge group's ties to China's military raise serious concerns, especially since the company has formed a People's Armed Militia. This is troubling because if such a group controls key facilities at the Panama Canal, it poses a significant security threat to the US. In the event of conflict, a Chinese military-linked presence at the canal could endanger American businesses and naval operations. To make matters worse, Hutchison Ports, a Hong Kong-based company, controls two important ports at the canal, Balboa on the Pacific side and Cristobal on the Atlantic side. Hutchison has had these leases since 1999 and recently renewed them. Although Hong Kong once operated separately from China, political changes mean Hutchison is now under increasing pressure from Beijing. It's likely China would try to influence these vital ports. This situation has angered former President Trump. He believes the Panama Canal, originally given to Panama by the US, is now under Chinese control. He even jokingly wished a Merry Christmas to Chinese soldiers operating the canal, though there's no evidence of Chinese troops being present. Nonetheless, the involvement of Chinese and Hong Kong companies in this strategic area raises suspicions. Panama's president has strongly rejected these claims, insisting that the canal is entirely run by Panamanians. However, considering Panama's growing ties with China, some worry that Beijing might influence the country's decisions. In 2017, Panama shifted its diplomatic allegiance from Taiwan to China.
Panama cut ties with Taiwan on Tuesday, switching allegiance to China and further isolating the small island nation.
And a year later, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Panama. China plays a major role in Panama's economy, with exports to China reaching $1.3 billion in 2023, including copper, a key resource in Panama. At the same time, Panama imports $1.8 billion worth of goods from China each year. Additionally, the colon-free zone in Panama handles billions in Chinese goods. This economic dependency could cause Panama to favor China over the US in the event of a conflict. Trump's frustrations with Panama's relationship with China could push him to take action. While invading Panama is unlikely due to its sovereignty, he may use diplomatic or economic pressure instead. Trump has suggested he could act tough, including withdrawing from trade agreements or blocking Chinese investments in Panama. If diplomacy fails, the US could explore alternative trade routes to lessen Panama's control of shipping, such as supporting the construction of a canal in Nicaragua or a new railway project in Mexico. Both projects could reduce the strategic importance of the Panama Canal. While military action seems unlikely, Trump has not ruled it out. If China were to establish military bases in Panama or a hostile government took power, military intervention might become a consideration. The US could quickly overpower Panama's limited defenses, but such an invasion would have serious global consequences, potentially damaging America's reputation. Given the US's history of intervention in Latin America, it's not entirely out of the question that the US might take extreme measures to protect its interests. If American security is threatened, military action could very well be considered. Thank you for watching.